There are several advantages to growing potatoes in containers rather than in the ground. Chief among them is it's easier to protect the plants from the critters that love to eat them, such as voles. Container potatoes are also a fun project to do with kids. The plants grow fast and produce a good yield for the space required. Harvesting potatoes in a container is like a treasure hunt for kids. Just turn over the container and let them sift through the soil for delicious rewards. The only real disadvantage to growing potatoes in containers is you have to be more vigilant about regular watering, as container soil dries out faster than the ground. It is important to keep your soil moist, but not waterlogged. If you check the soil moisture often and water deeply, you should have an abundant potato harvest. When to plant potatoes in containers. Timing for planting potatoes in containers is not much different from planting them in the ground. The general recommendation for in-ground potatoes is to plant them about 2 weeks before the last frost in your region, when you may be able to bump the planting date forward a little when planting in containers, as the soil will warm up faster when exposed to the sun above the ground. However, be prepared to cover or bring your potato containers indoors if a late spring frost is predicted. Although it's not a common method, potatoes can be grown indoors in the winter, provided you can give them adequate heat and light. Some people grow them in a greenhouse over winter, but they will grow nicely in a window that receives plenty of direct sunlight or undergrow lights. Before getting started, the process for growing potatoes in containers, grow bags, or the ground is a little different than it is for other vegetables. Potatoes are grown using a hilling technique in which the stems are gradually buried by heaping additional soil around the plant as it grows upward. The lower buried stems will develop additional root structures potatoes as the hill grows higher. For this reason, hilling is essential to getting the maximum harvest from each potato plant. Burying the stems also prevents the potatoes from being exposed to light, which makes them turn green. When growing potatoes in containers, the hilling process looks a little different, but the basics are the same. When first planted, the seed potatoes are just barely covered with soil. As the plant grows, additional soil is heaped around the plant at regular intervals until the container is filled. When growing potatoes in containers, the hilling process looks a little different, but the basics are the same. When first planted, the seed potatoes are just barely covered with soil. As the plant grows, additional soil is heaped around the plant at regular intervals until the container is filled. When growing potatoes in containers, use high-quality potting soil that is fast-draining, especially if you're using a plastic container. Organic soils are always a good choice as well. One good option is a half-and-half mixture of commercial potting soil and quality compost. Don't use ordinary garden soil for growing potatoes in containers. It drains poorly and contains pathogens and weed seeds. Potatoes can be grown in many different types of opaque containers, ideally about 2 to 3 feet tall with a 10 to 15 gallon capacity. To avoid containers taller than this, because it can be hard to water the plants evenly, which can cause potatoes to rot. Specialty potato sacks are available at garden centers or online garden retailers, but any number of other repurposed containers will also work, including wooden half barrels, garbage bins, plastic storage tubs, chimney flues, burlap sacks, canvas tote bags. Whatever container you choose, make sure it has good drainage. Mix an organic, slow-release fertilizer into the potting soil. In addition to this upfront feeding, use a diluted liquid fertilizer, such as fish emulsion, every couple of weeks as your potatoes grow. Potatoes grown in containers need plenty of water, which can leach out nutrients from the soil. For this reason, plants that are grown in containers generally need more feeding than they do when growing in the ground. One of the advantages of using an organic fertilizer is that it's much more forgiving if you accidentally pour too much. If you use too much conventional fertilizer, it can easily burn your plants.
Place the container in full sun. Fill the container with about 4 to 6 inches of potting soil that has been blended with compost and fertilizer. Place the prepared seed potato pieces onto the potting mix with the eyebuds facing up. The plants will grow fairly large, so make sure to give them some breathing room. For example, a container that is around 20 inches can handle about 4 small seed potatoes. It may not seem like much when you're planting, but the size of your potato harvest will surprise you.
After you have positioned the seed potatoes, cover them with a couple of inches of prepared potting soil. Don't get too enthusiastic here because you don't want to plant them too deep. About 1 to 4 inches of soil is perfect. The cooler the climate, the less soil you should put on top. Potatoes will not grow without sun and water. Make sure your container receives at least 6 to 8 hours of sun a day. Water your newly planted potatoes well. Remember that one of the keys to growing potatoes is keeping your soil moist, but not wet. Check the container at least once a day. To check the moisture level, stick your finger at least an inch into the soil or up to your second knuckle. If it feels dry, it's time to water. If it's very hot or windy, you may have to water your potato container gardens more than once a day.
Make sure to water deeply by waiting until water runs out the bottom. It is counterproductive just to water the surface of the soil. The nice thing about containers is you can visibly see. When you've watered deeply enough, simply watch for water to seep out of the container's bottom, and you'll know that they have a sufficient amount of water.
Once your potato plants have grown about 6 inches, you need to hill them. This is done by adding a couple of inches of prepared soil around your potato plants, covering the growing stems at the bottom. Be careful not to break the plants in the process. The goal is to bury about 1/3 of the plant, covering the lower leaves with soil. The buried stems will produce more potatoes, so this hilling procedure is essential to a good harvest. You will need to repeat this hilling process a few more times as your plants grow. You can also stop once the soil reaches the top of your container. Potato plants grow incredibly fast, so keep an eye on them and don't let them get ahead of you. You can begin to harvest potatoes anytime after the plants have flowered. Carefully reach down into the soil of your container and pull out a few new potatoes at a time. Late in the season, as the plants turn yellow and die back, you can harvest all of the remaining potatoes at once.
The easiest way to do this is to turn the container over, dumping it into a wheelbarrow or onto a tarp. You can then freely paw through the soil. To find all of the potatoes, you may find a few really tiny potatoes, but don't chuck them. Those can be some of the best and sweetest potatoes of the year, and they're perfect for tossing whole into a stew.